Jim's life as a truck driver seems simple until a chance encounter with the past opens up wounds that he thought had healed. An unexpected encounter with his ex-wife brings him back to the past, full of pain and suffering. "Jim, let's stop at the diner." In holy cow, Hank's shout burst over the CB radio just moments after the most massive lightning bolt I'd ever witnessed zipped across the road and struck a stalled horse trailer on the opposite side of the highway. The flash nearly blinded me, and I knew I'd need to gather myself at the next stop. If my mom had been sitting beside me, she'd have crossed herself and whispered a prayer to St. Jude for anyone or anything in that trailer. Me, I just let out a long whistle and kept cruising at 65 miles per hour. I was hauling an oversized load through the Cascades, a long bed of rotors destined for a wind farm. Don't get me started on the debates over placing giant fans at the top of mountains. I get both sides, but I'm just here to deliver the cargo and earn my paycheck. Hank, the lead driver, you've seen the type, usually in a compact car with a flashing light and a big, oversized sign. Needed a pit stop and another cup of coffee. Still hasn't figured out the connection. There's a small cafe with truck parking about 10 miles east of Vantage, so that's where Hank finally exited the highway. I decided I could use a meal myself after spending 4 hours getting out of the dock in Tacoma and battling west side traffic. I was famished. I parked the rig and headed inside. She was impossible to miss, the most attractive woman in the place. Granted, that's not saying much, since the only other woman there weighed a couple hundred lbs and was sporting a tavern jacket, very classy. I took a seat at the counter and watched as the waitress finished taking an order from a group of roughnecks in the corner. An old Ronnie Millsap song played in my head. That girl who waits on tables used to wait for me at home. I kept my gaze on this beauty as she pinned the order for the cook and turned to take mine. The look in her eyes upon recognizing me was hard to read. Was it surprise, amusement, annoyance, or a mix of all three? "Well, Jim, of all the gin joints in all the towns," she remembered. It was a famous line from Casablanca, where Humphrey Bogart is stunned to see his former lover walk into his bar with another man. I had taken Nancy to see Casablanca at an art house theater back when we were married. "What brings you here?" "Just coffee and a Denver omelet," Nancy replied, turning and posting the order. Just then, Hank emerged from the restroom. He glanced at Nancy for a moment and then sat down next to me. "Isn't that her? Isn't who you wouldn't know you've never met her? I saw the photos on your visor when I handed you the logbook. Hard to miss someone like that." "Who is she?" "My ex, and the biggest mistake of my life. Marrying that lovely woman wasn't the error. The true mistake was letting her leave. To help you understand how my love life deteriorated and why I'm still longing for and carrying photos of a woman who left me 5 years ago, I need to rewind far back to my high school years. That's when my life began to veer off course for the first time. Jocelyn Murphy was the most beautiful girl at our school, with a captivating smile. She was slightly heavier than average, much of which contributed to her graceful presence. At the start of our senior year, I finally mustered the courage to ask her out. We hit it off, and for the rest of the year, we were inseparable. Our relationship grew closer over time, given the situation. A very attractive girl and a moderately good-looking guy. I felt incredibly fortunate and became quite devoted to her as an 18-year-old in a steady relationship. I couldn't have been happier. Meanwhile, one of my teammates, Spencer Kresser, was known for his lack of commitment. He was a decent athlete, a starter on both the football and basketball teams, but not a standout. Although he wasn't particularly tall or physically imposing, he was dating the most popular girl in school. Unfortunately, he didn't treat her well. While he wasn't outwardly aggressive, his behavior was often dismissive and disrespectful. For example, there was a story going around that one night Spencer was driving Debbie Drake and a couple of other friends home from a party. Debbie was sitting up front with him, and the others were in the back. At one point, Spencer made a comment that led to a tense exchange between him and Debbie, making her visibly uncomfortable. It was the kind of interaction that raised concerns among those who heard about it. I found it unsettling and made a mental note to continue treating Jocelyn with respect, appreciating the bond we shared. After graduation, I enrolled in a diesel technology school for the fall and started working at a lube depot. Jocelyn, who hadn't applied to a 4-year college, found a job at a dress shop in the mall. We continued to date exclusively, shared special moments, and planned our future together. Then everything changed. Through her father's connections, Jocelyn's parents managed to get her a probationary acceptance at a state college down south, 300 miles away. Whether this was to further her education or to distance her from me, I never found out. In January, Jocelyn left for the spring semester, and our story took a new turn. Over the next 5 months, I stayed dedicated to Jocelyn. I sent her letters, called her every couple of days, and visited her twice. During my first visit, though we reconnected, something felt different. The usual spark between us seemed muted. After spending time together, we lay on her bed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. "Does everything feel okay?" I asked. She smiled and said, "Not every time is the same. It might take us a bit to get back in sync after being apart for so long. Don't overthink it, Jim. Let's just get some rest." The following day, we enjoyed each other's company and shared meaningful moments. I left feeling reassured and confident. 5 weeks later, I drove down to see her again, but she mentioned it was a tough time for her. So, a few hugs and moments of affection were all we shared before I headed back. On Sunday afternoon, when spring break came around, she said she was too busy studying to come home. Jocelyn kept me guessing. Her letters, though infrequent, always ended with "Love, Jocelyn," and she never ended a call without telling me she loved me. She was due back for Memorial Day weekend, school was over, and she hadn't met her probation requirements. I was excited to welcome her back. I even had the ring she'd picked out the previous Christmas in my pocket. I called to ask if I could visit on her first day back. "Yeah, come over, Jim.
We need to talk," she said.
Back then, I was so naive. "Absolutely, we do," I thought, smiling as I got into my truck and headed to her house. When she opened the door, I saw an older man talking with her parents inside. Jocelyn stepped outside and closed the door behind her. I leaned in to kiss her, but she turned her head just enough that we ended up with a light kiss on the cheek. Surprised, I dropped the ring box I was holding, and it fell to the pavement. I quickly picked it up, but not before she noticed it. "Jim, I'm pregnant," she said. My first thought was, did something go wrong with our protection? Then I wondered when was the last time we were together. What I actually asked was, "How far along are you?" 2 months, she replied. That answered all my unspoken questions, but I had one more. "Is it with the guy inside?" Tears welled up in Jocelyn's eyes as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Jim." "Me too," I said. "I hope he treats you as well as I have, and would have." I didn't truly mean it. I doubted anyone could care for her the way I did, and maybe someday she'd realize that perhaps I'm not always the nice guy I think I am. She married him and moved back south. Turns out he was her university-assigned tutor. I never saw Jocelyn after that, but mutual friends told me she faced difficulties during and after her pregnancy. Within 3 years, they divorced, and Jocelyn moved back home with her parents. Looking back on how everything turned out, I can't help but think of G. Brooks's song, Unanswered Prayers, where he sings about meeting an old flame and realizing he's better off. A little over a year later, on my 21st birthday, my friends took me out to celebrate my official entry into adulthood. The night turned into a blur of laughter, new experiences, and maybe a bit too much rye. At some point, I met Cecilia, and from that night on, she became a part of my life in a way I never expected. By morning, she was still there, and within a week, she had started bringing her belongings into my apartment, just a few suitcases and a box. There was something about Cecilia that made me lose all sense of logic. She had a captivating beauty and a presence that made me feel fully alive and understood. Over the 2 years we were together, I became so invested in our relationship that I even started losing friends, and my relationship with my mother grew distant. I defended her fiercely to anyone who suggested caution, and within the year, we were married. We shared a strong connection, and I made sure to treat her with care and attention. Cecilia didn't need to work, and I didn't mind, as long as we shared the responsibilities at home. While I was at work, she kept herself entertained with hobbies, visiting the gym, and as I later discovered, perhaps a few other pastimes. We spent a lot of time together, and I showed my appreciation in ways that I thought would make her happy. However, as time passed, small things started to add up. Cecilia's priorities seemed to drift, and I felt an increasing distance between us. Our connection was once full of laughter and excitement, but I started realizing there were sides to her life that she kept separate from me. It left me questioning the choices we had made and where we stood with each other. A week later, Cecilia introduced another surprise. Sitting on her side of the bed, she seemed excited and playful. She reached into her nightstand and pulled out a larger item, sparking my curiosity about what else she might have tucked away in there. We spent the evening closer than ever, enjoying each other's company. Cecilia's energy was captivating, and we both felt completely connected, sharing moments of laughter and warmth. Afterward, I took a shower and ran a hot bath for her to relax in. As she sank into the water, I sat nearby, just appreciating her and wondering what other surprises she might have in mind. Within a week, she began dropping hints about her own thoughts. "Have you ever considered swapping partners with another couple?" she asked one evening, seemingly out of nowhere. I didn't engage with her hints at first, but after a few more days, she became more direct. "What are your fantasies, Jim? Have you ever thought about us exploring something new together?" I told Cecilia that none of these ideas appealed to me. She was all I wanted, and I felt completely fulfilled. She responded by creating more distance, taking time for herself, and spending evenings out with friends. In response, I brought her flowers, took her out more often, and tried to be more thoughtful around the house. She continued having more girls' nights out, and I tried to support her independence. One evening, instead of returning to an empty apartment while Cecilia was out, I went to visit my mother. "She's cheating on you, Jim," she said bluntly. "I don't know that, Mom," I replied. "We're just going through a rough patch, and she says she needs time with her friends." "Open your eyes, son," my mother said sternly, surprising me. She got up, grabbed the phone book, and made a call. I could only hear her side of the conversation. "Is Fred Thompson there? Can I speak with him?" There was a brief pause, then she continued. "Fred, it's Helen. Is Cecilia there? And is she acting the same as before?" Another brief pause. "Okay, I'm heading over there with Jim. We'll wait outside." As we drove to the Lucky 7 bar across town, Mom filled me in. "Your Uncle Fred has seen Cecilia there twice. She probably doesn't remember meeting him at your wedding. He told me she spends time with almost anyone who asks her to dance and has been seen leaving with some of them." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because you made it clear you didn't want me interfering," Mom replied. "I hoped you'd figure it out on your own, without me bringing bad news, but tonight I had no choice. I can't stand seeing you hurt. This might be hard, but maybe it'll be for the best in the long run. You got over Jason. You'll get over Cecilia." Mom made it sound like my marriage was ending, but I wasn't so sure. Could I handle the idea of Cecilia possibly having a romantic connection with someone else? I needed to see for myself. We parked across the street and waited. It didn't take long. Within half an hour, Cecilia came out of the bar with 2 men. I held on to the hope that they were just stepping outside for fresh air. However, they headed toward a large SUV. Cecilia got into the back seat with one of the men, while the others stood outside. The parking lot was well lit, so we could see enough to understand what might be going on. My mother kept watching me for my reaction as I processed what was happening. We crossed the street to get a better look, and though it was uncomfortable, the scene in the car left little doubt about Cecilia's actions. Mom, calm as always, took out her camera and snapped a couple of photos from a respectful distance. One of the men noticed us and called out. Cecilia looked up, recognizing me, but by then we were heading back to our car. After that night, Uncle Fred connected me with a reputable attorney, one he knew from personal experience. The attorney agreed to represent me after reviewing the photos, saying this should be straightforward. There wasn't much to divide in terms of assets, and the judge determined that Cecilia was employable, so I only had to pay minimal alimony until the divorce was finalized. After the judge's ruling, Cecilia approached me outside the courtroom. "Jim, isn't there something I can say or do to make you change your mind?" With a quiet resolve And with my mother's and Uncle Fred's support echoing in my mind, I replied, "No. See, too much has happened, and I can't see past it. I wish you well." My words seemed to set something off in Cecilia. "You really thought you were the only one? How clueless can you be?" Her words were sharp, echoing years of resentment. Both of our lawyers looked stunned as Cecilia's anger spilled out. Just then, a firm voice cut through the tension. The judge stood at the doorway. "All four of you in my chambers now." Later, my attorney confided that she'd never seen anything like it. The judge reversed her own decision, removed Cecilia's alimony, and ordered her to cover my legal fees out of her share. Justice may be impartial, but it doesn't miss a word. Looking back, I probably should have sought therapy after the divorce. Twice, I'd poured everything into my relationships, only to end up here. It was clear I needed to rethink my approach. Not long after, while working in Tacoma, I discovered a small diner near my office. The first time I saw her, I couldn't look away. She had a graceful presence, carrying trays with ease and moving as if she was floating. I discreetly checked her left hand. No ring. Her name tag read Nancy. The diner quickly became a regular spot for me. Sometimes I'd be seated in her section, and we'd chat briefly. I made a habit of leaving a generous tip, hoping to show genuine kindness. Finally, one day I decided to take a chance. "Would you like to grab a coffee sometime?" She laughed lightly, not unkindly. "You're asking a diner waitress to go out for coffee?" I laughed along. "All right, maybe not coffee. Anything else? Dinner, a movie? You name it. Can you handle a chick flick?" "I want to see the new Drew Barrymore movie, Fever Pitch." "Only if you'll agree to see the new Batman movie with me when it comes out next month," she replied, without missing a beat. "The one with Christian Bale. It's a date." Within just 2 weeks, Nancy and I became exclusive, and by the third, we were lovers. She was sweet yet spirited, with a smile that lit up her eyes and spread across her whole face. When I took her fishing in Puget Sound, I was amazed when she reeled in a 15-pound sockeye salmon. She brought it right up to my net, then effortlessly handled it herself, placing it in the cooler without any help. We hiked through Mount Rainier National Park and spent the night camping in a small tent. The next morning, she surprised me by taking a completely naked dip in a chilly mountain stream. I realized I was falling in love. One afternoon, I stopped by to see my mom. I hadn't visited since Nancy became a significant part of my life. Mom's brother was sitting at the kitchen table while she made grilled cheese sandwiches and served up 2 bowls of her famous bean soup. After I shared my feelings about Nancy and asked when might be a good time to introduce her, Mom glanced over at Uncle Fred. "Here we go again," she sighed. "Mom, I really think this time is different. You'll see when you meet her," I assured her. "We'll see," she said. "Your Uncle Fred and Aunt Lena are coming over for supper next Sunday. Why don't you bring her then?" That Sunday dinner surpassed all expectations. By the end of the afternoon, Mom and Aunt Lena were sharing family recipes with Nancy, including the secret tips not written on the cards. Nancy spent an hour swapping fishing tales with Uncle Fred. The king salmon Uncle Fred caught in Alaska last year had somehow grown to 50 pounds and longer than his outstretched arms. Nancy let him have his victory after that story. On our way home that night, I asked, "So, when do I get to meet your family?" "They're both gone," she replied softly. "Oh my gosh, Nancy, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Until today, neither of us talked much about our families," she explained. "It's been 5 years, and I still miss them, so I tend to avoid the subject." She explained this was unfamiliar ground for me, and I wasn't sure what to say. But I decided to ask, would it be okay if I asked how they passed away? A drunken high driver crossed the center line on Route 18. Dad died instantly, but Mom held on for a few weeks. It was awful. I was the one who had to decide to let her go. No child should have to make the decision to turn off the machine, keeping their parent alive. Nancy began to cry. "I'm sorry. That explains your strong feelings about drinking and driving. I always thought you were a bit extreme about it, but now I understand why it matters so much to you." While Mom was in the hospital, I dropped out of school and couldn't afford to go back after she died. That's when I started working as a waitress. The tips make the pay decent, but there's not much left over at the end of the month, so school has been put on hold. Didn't your dad have life insurance? Or couldn't you get anything from the other driver's insurance? No, the other driver didn't have insurance, and since Mom lived for 3 weeks after Dad died, all his life insurance went to her, which only ended up paying for her medical bills. After everything was settled, I ended up with less than $10,000, which basically covered the bills I accumulated while staying in the hospital with Mom. That's one of the crazy things about our system. It's like a lottery. If a UPS truck or a state vehicle had killed my parents, I'd be a multimillionaire. But some drunk and high driver without insurance wipes out my family, and I end up flat broke. I'm not saying I wish I were rich at the expense of losing my family. I'd trade everything I own just to have one more conversation with Mom and Dad, just one more meal around our dining room table. They were truly wonderful, loving people. You would have liked them, and I think they would have liked you too. We pulled up to her apartment as she finished, tears running down her cheeks. I walked her to the door. She took my hand and led me inside. We slept in her bed that night, without making love. She just snuggled into my chest, with my arm around her shoulders. I was falling deeper in love with this woman. Within 6 months of our first date, Nancy and I were engaged. It was a short engagement. We eloped to Vegas within a month. Mom was upset she wasn't at our wedding, but she was thrilled I had found such a wonderful woman. Things were great during the first 6 months of our marriage. We made love almost every night, and both our jobs were going as well as could be expected. Nancy was still waitressing, and I was a diesel mechanic at the local Dodge dealer, mostly working on Cummins engines in the big Dodge trucks. Then the dealership closed, and with it, of course, my job. I didn't waste any time. I visited every shop and dealership within 60 miles in search of a new job. Nancy was incredibly supportive, always lifting my spirits whenever I began to lose hope. She even took on an extra shift each week to prevent our finances from suffering too much. Finally, after 6 weeks, I secured a position at an independent garage outside of town. The commute wasn't bad, but I'd only be making 3/4 of what I earned at the Dodge dealership. My attitude started to mirror our new financial situation, strained. It didn't help that my new boss was somewhat difficult. He had seemed like such a nice guy when we discussed the position, but the longer I worked under him, as he often phrased it, the more his remarks felt sharp and offensive. A couple of the other mechanics were friendly, as was the woman who managed the front desk and handled the bookkeeping. She seemed nice, but after working there for 3 months, it became apparent that she and the boss were spending time in the office engaging in an affair. I felt sorry for her expecting husband. He'd stop by every few weeks of bringing her flowers or taking her out for lunch. I almost told him he was being deceived. Recalling how no one informed me when Cecilia was unfaithful until my mom did, but I decided to mind my own business. I believe our marriage was still in good shape, but the constant struggle to pay bills and save for the future was starting to wear on me. The few arguments we had always centered around money. Nancy was usually the practical one, while I seemed to need something new every once in a while. Our biggest disagreement started when I mentioned to Nancy that I was considering buying a new hunting rifle. The rifle, in scope, would be a substantial expense, I argued. Jim, I thought we were saving for a house, she said. Nancy, I just wanted to get something for myself, I replied. But you bought a rifle just a couple of years ago. Why do you need another one? She asked. Did I complain when you got a sewing machine? I retorted. That was secondhand and didn't cost nearly as much, she reasoned. Her points were fair, but I was still set on getting that rifle. Our conversation got a bit tense, and for the first time, we ended the evening on a quiet note, with no final good night or I love you. I realized later I'd been too focused on my own wants. Looking back, I can see that Nancy was just trying to keep us on track. Regretful, I stopped by a nearby tavern the next evening to gather my thoughts before heading home. While at the bar, a voice called out to me from behind, "Aren't you Jim Peterson?" I looked up to see Spencer, an old high school classmate. He greeted me with genuine enthusiasm, reminding me of those simpler days. He mentioned a few familiar faces from high school, and we spent some time reminiscing, catching up on how much had changed since we last met. I knew I should have been upset with how he spoke about a girl I once loved. Any gentleman would have said something, but I chose to let it go. "Let me buy you a beer," he said. "Let's toast to all the women we've known, and those we have yet to meet." Even though Spencer and I didn't hang out during high school, he seemed to enjoy my company now. We shared a few more beers and swapped life stories. I glossed over most of mine, but went into detail about my current relationship with Nancy. I thought I expressed happiness about my marriage, but I made the mistake of mentioning our recent disagreement. "You know what your problem is, Jim? You're completely under her thumb. You treat these women like goddesses, and they end up walking all over you. You need to make sure your woman knows you're the man and that you're in charge." I was skeptical and was about to respond when we were interrupted. "Spence, honey, there you are?" I turned to see a stunning blonde standing next to Spencer. He looked annoyed. "Mandy, what's wrong with you? I'm here talking to my friend, and you're interrupting. Go grab us a table. I'll join you when I'm done talking to Jim." "Order me a beer with that," he added. Mandy turned and sat at one of the tables. She almost looked like a loyal pet waiting for her owner. I expected Spencer to say something like, "See, that's how it's done." But what surprised me most was that Spencer acted as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Women simply did as they were told. After we finished our beers, I stood up to leave. Spencer handed me his business card, told me to give him a call, and then walked over to Mandy, who seemed thrilled. My mind was more confused than ever. What had I just witnessed? Just like in high school, Spencer was treating people with a complete lack of respect, yet they were drawn to him. Meanwhile, I tried to be considerate and ended up feeling hurt. Nancy hadn't done anything to hurt me, but my frustration was building. Instead of going home and apologizing to Nancy for my behavior the night before, I acted poorly when I got home. In response to her warm greeting, I bluntly asked, "What's for dinner?" She had prepared a lovely meal, which I spoiled by deliberately adding too much salt, not once but twice, making sure she noticed. After dinner, Nancy cleared the table and washed the dishes while I watched a basketball game. That night, I acted indifferent, ignoring her quiet sigh. The next morning, I woke up to the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls. Nancy always prepared breakfast, but in my current state, I failed to appreciate it. Maybe Spencer is onto something, I thought. Over the next few months, I started spending more time with Spencer, and my marriage suffered. During that time, Nancy was reflecting on the person she had married. Looking back, she probably should have sought advice from family or friends about my behavior. The problem was, no matter how distant I became, Nancy kept trying to show her love and support. This only intensified the negative ideas Spencer was putting in my head. A week before things finally fell apart, Nancy had a serious conversation with me after dinner. "Jem, I love you, but this is hurting me. If you don't like it, you can leave," she said. I replied coldly, and her reaction made it clear how deeply my words hurt her. She began to cry and went to bed, while I stayed up and poured myself another beer. On Saturday, Nancy had to work all day. I went to the tavern before noon and began drinking with Spencer, Mandy, and another friend. Spencer, always charismatic, was clearly interested in our new acquaintance, shifting his attention to make her laugh while I watched. "Want to take a chance, Jem? I'm married, but that doesn't mean you can't enjoy some fun. Look at this woman's confidence. Ever thought you could connect with someone like that?" This conversation started a spiral leading to decisions I'd later regret. Looking back, I can see the toll it took on Nancy and on our relationship. This kind of approach was familiar, judging by Mandy's reaction. She sat beside me as Spencer laughed, took the redhead by the hand, and led her to the dance floor. The jukebox was playing some hip-hop, and Spencer and the redhead soon drew attention with their playful dancing. Mandy then pulled me up and seemed determined to match the redhead's energy. After a while, I decided to ask her directly, "Why do you let Spencer influence you like this? Why are you here with me?" Mandy replied, "Because if I don't, I risk losing touch with him completely. I know he's not committed, and I'm honestly not too worried about that. This way, Everyone seems to get what they want, plus your nice company. Her response didn't fully make sense to me, but by then, I was drawn into the moment. We continued dancing, and at one point, she leaned in and kissed me, leaving me taken aback. "Was that your wife?" I asked. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. There was a woman with long brown hair, dressed in casual clothes, standing by the entrance. She watched us for a moment, then just turned and left. Alarmed, I dashed out of the bar just in time to catch a glimpse of New York's car as it drove away down the street. As you can imagine, she didn't come home or respond to any of my calls all weekend. By Monday, I returned from work to find the apartment nearly empty. Her rings were gone, and there was a short note left for me that simply read, "I found the door on Friday." I received the doc for our marriage dissolution that same Friday night. I became intoxicated and punched Spencer Crare in the nose. I ended up spending Saturday and Sunday in jail. By Monday, I found myself before the same judge who had overseen my divorce from Cecilia. "You look familiar, Mr. Peterson. Have you been in my courtroom before?" "Yes, Your Honor." I reminded her of our previous meeting. "All right, what's this nonsense about you hitting Mr. Spencer Crasser in the nose?" I explained to the judge the circumstances and reasons behind my actions. "What are you planning to do now? Are you going to cause any more trouble?" I informed the judge of the decision I made while I was in jail over the weekend. "You are given a 6-month suspended sentence. If you follow through with what you've said and stay out of trouble, the charges will be dropped and your record will be expunged." With that, she struck the gavel. The following day, I honored my commitment to the judge by making my way to the Army Recruitment Center. This decision wasn't made on a whim. A recruiter had approached me several months prior. The Army was seeking skilled diesel mechanics and offered an attractive enlistment package. While I never considered joining while I was married, my foolish actions had already severed that possibility. Assured that I would work as a mechanic and wouldn't be required to carry a rifle, I signed the contract right after boot camp, where they attempted to retrain me in rifle handling. Though old habits are hard to break, I was deployed to Forward Operating Base Shira in Afghanistan. In the base garage, I met my new teammates and saw the service bay equipped with all the tools I would need for the duration of my deployment. My first 2 hours were spent cleaning the tools left behind by the corporal I was replacing. Someone mentioned that he was very thorough until the day a mortar nearly took his life. Fortunately, the mortar landed on the opposite side of the vehicle he was working on, causing only minor injuries and leaving him deeply shaken. He wouldn't be returning. After cleaning the tools, I began working on my first vehicle, a Humvee. During the 15 months I was stationed there, I was fortunate enough to never have to fire a weapon, and even better, no one fired at me. Though there were a few unsuccessful attempts, I spent the vast majority of my time within the relative safety of the base. But occasionally, I volunteered to drive one of the large trucks when supplies were needed. That's where I truly learned how to operate a big rig. My motivation for volunteering wasn't heroism, but rather the special privileges it earned me from the senior officers, such as a few extra days of rest and relaxation. I served 3 years in the Army, ultimately reaching the rank of specialist in the motor pool at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. After receiving an honorable discharge, I returned home to Washington State. Not everyone shares the positive experience I had during my military service, but for me, it was the best thing that had happened up to that point in my life. Growing up in my environment, I had limited interactions with men or women from different ethnic or racial backgrounds, perhaps a few Jewish or Asian kids, but not much else. My closest friend at Shira was a black man from Los Angeles. When his tour ended, we were virtually brothers from different mothers. His name was Scotty Johnson, and he did so much for me that I can never repay him. One of the lessons I learned from Scotty was boxing before he enlisted. Scotty was an amateur boxer in Los Angeles, and with not much to do on the base, we often spent our time at the gym. There's a limit to how many hours you can dedicate to video games and internet surfing, so the workouts started to feel monotonous. So Scotty offered to teach me how to box. We purchased gloves, headgear, and a few training bags online. The initial 2 months were pretty rough. Scotty was relentless, constantly teasing me with light jabs, never hitting too hard. However, after those first few months, I began to grasp the basics. I discovered that I could absorb a punch, much like Joe Frazier, allowing my opponent to land a few hits while I closed in and delivered some effective strikes. After Scotty was deployed, I tried to stay in shape, but it wasn't quite the same until I joined a camp that had an official amateur boxing team. Being part of a team reinforced the discipline that boxing demands, marking another milestone in my personal growth. During the 6 months I was stationed in Germany, 2 individuals significantly contributed to my growth into manhood by becoming my friends, Sergeant Major Ramon Morales and his wife, Kate. They took me under their guidance and resided off base in Stuttgart. They invited me to dinner at least every other week. Has there ever been a more loving and respectful couple? Growing up with a single mother, I never truly understood what a loving adult relationship looked like. While my mother was always supportive and affectionate, I never saw her with a partner. Ramon and Kate showed me what I had been missing and how I should have treated Nancy. Ramon and Kate hailed from different backgrounds in Texas. Kate was a WP who lived near Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and attended Southern Methodist University, SMU. Ramon came from a Catholic, working-class family. Their shared heritage was the key to their meeting and eventual courtship. They both descended from ancestors who fought and died alongside heroes like Crockett, Bowie, and Travis in the defense of the Alamo. They first met in the Alamo courtyard during the 150th anniversary celebration honoring their forefathers. They struck up a conversation, dined together on the River Walk, and exchanged contact information. Ramon was pleasantly surprised when Kate answered his call, having feared she might have given a fake number. Fast forward 21 years, and I found myself at their Stuttgart dining table, learning the intricacies of a successful marriage while wondering if I would ever meet someone as wonderful as Nancy. I realized that a strong relationship wasn't just about giving gifts or catering to each other's desires. It was fundamentally about respect. The Morales' mutual respect extended beyond just the two of them. Their children also showed the same courtesy to one another and to their parents. I almost used the term common courtesy, but we all know their respect was anything but ordinary. Around this time, I began reaching out to my mother to see if she was in touch with Nancy. My mother still viewed me as the immature kid who had left Washington, which is why she hadn't gotten involved. Additionally, Nancy had started dating someone and had moved to Ellensburg, so my mother chose to stay out of it. I understand her reasons. Upon returning to Washington, I secured a job in a garage and spent most weekends driving an 18-wheeler. This was my routine the day I walked into a diner near Vantage. Now that I knew where Nancy was employed, I was left wondering what my next move should be. I stopped by the cafe on Sunday night while returning to the West Side. Nancy wasn't on duty, but I enjoyed a fantastic slice of apple pie and learned from the kind waitress when Nancy would be working again. Armed with this new information, I made my plans. The next Friday evening found me in the same spot at the counter. Nancy seemed less surprised to see me this time. However, she was noticeably taken aback by the bouquet of blue irises placed beside me. Doris mentioned that a man came in last Sunday night asking about me, she said. When she described him, I thought it might be you. Are these for me? Did I guess right? I replied, it's been far too long since I last gave you flowers, but it looks like these are the same ones you held that afternoon in Vegas. I thought such scenes only happened in movies, but as Nancy accepted the bouquet from my hand, half the diner began to applaud. Thank you, Jem, she said, tears welling up in her eyes before she wiped them away. Would you consider talking with me this weekend, anytime, anywhere? I asked. I close up here at 11 o'clock. Come back, and we can sit and talk. As I left the diner, I turned and said, I'm not the same person anymore. Thanks, Nancy. I drove up to the overlook above the Columbia River just to focus my thoughts. At 10:30 to 11 o'clock, I arrived at the diner parking area. The establishment was deserted. Even the cook had already left for the day. Nancy secured the door behind me, and we began to update each other on our lives. She had finally returned to her studies, now a junior at Central Washington University, majoring in elementary education. I was relieved to hear that Cliff, the man she had been seeing, was no longer involved. This has been lovely, Jim, she said, but I need to head home and catch some sleep. I have a double shift on Fridays and Saturdays. Can we have dinner on Sunday?
I asked.
Yes, that would be great. Nancy and I took our seats in the booth at the Palace Cafe in Ellensburg, one of the more upscale dining spots in this region of Washington. The drive from her house had been quiet, but Nancy initiated the conversation. I was so relieved to hear you made it home safely from the army, Jenny Hansen informed me. You were back during your first year away. Your mother and I spent several evenings praying for your well-being. I'm glad those prayers were answered. Why did you never respond to my mother's letters? She asked. She truly saw you as a daughter, and it devastated her not to hear from you over the past few years. She even left a few messages on your answering machine because she mentioned she didn't have your cell number. Nancy's complexion turned pale. Cliff must have intercepted the letters and deleted the messages. He was extremely jealous of my marriage and wanted me to end my relationship with your mother. He claimed it was unhealthy for a woman to maintain friendships with her ex-husband's family. He was determined that I stop communicating with your mom. I was attempting to build a new life with a new partner and initially thought I should respect his demands. When I didn't receive any word from your mother, he insisted it was for the best. He said she was only reaching out to reconcile us. I took his word, especially after several months of no calls or letters from her. She used to be so diligent about remembering birthdays and sending cards. Cliff, that controlling son of a gun, manipulated me into believing the worst. Please let your mom know how sorry I am, I said. I will, and I know she'll be happy to hear how you feel about her. You can probably expect a call soon after I explain what happened. No, I'll call tomorrow, Nancy replied. This situation has dragged on too long. Well, Cliff was correct, Nancy continued. Mom does want us to reconcile. She was thrilled to hear I ran into you and that you agreed to have dinner with me. However, she also mentioned she didn't want to act as a mediator or interfere in our personal matters while I was stationed overseas. I asked her to reach out to you, but she declined, saying I needed to do it myself. The problem was I was too clueless and didn't know how to initiate contact. By the time I was discharged, you were gone, and Mom said you had moved in with another man.
I wish your mom had said something.
I was still in love with you back then, and might have ended things with Cliff before it was too late. I was struck by the phrase back then. I was still in love with you back then, and it hurt deeply once again. I berated myself for being such an idiot. My mother's reason for not getting involved or passing along my message of love to Nancy was justified. She didn't believe I would follow through. Mom explained, you already hurt the poor girl once, and I won't help you hurt her again. She feared that I might return from the service with some random woman and a ring on her finger. What she didn't know is that I spent those 3 years yearning for what I had lost, though I did seek some female companionship occasionally, but that's another story. Our dinner arrived, and we moved on to more ordinary topics until dessert. So, tell me about Cliff. Cliff Ray was another one of my major mistakes. She immediately realized her slip and looked at me in horror. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it that way. She glanced down, her face turning red. I reached out and took her hands across the table. It's okay. I really messed up. You deserved better, but please tell me about Cliff. Cliff seemed wonderful at first. After our divorce, I didn't date anyone for months, then went out with some decent guys, and then Cliff appeared. He said all the right things. He was moving to Ellensburg, and I decided to leave Tacoma. We moved in together. However, as time went on, he became increasingly controlling. He would come to the diner and sit at the far end of the counter, watching me. My boss eventually banned him from coming in during my shifts, saying he made customers uncomfortable, which was probably true. My tips were cut in half whenever Cliff was around. Once he was banned, he accused both me and my boss of having an affair. Things deteriorated from there. We broke up 6 months ago, but he still lingers. Ellensburg is a small town, and it's been tough. It's ironic I left you, but didn't want you to leave, and within 2 weeks, you were gone. I left Cliff and never wanted to see him again, but he keeps showing up. I took Nancy home and gave her a gentle kiss goodnight. We arranged to meet again the following Sunday. Nancy must have called Mom on Monday morning because Monday night, I received an enthusiastic call from her. "Jim, I can't begin to express how happy I am. I heard your date last night went really well. I had such a wonderful conversation with Nancy today, Mom. I'm glad, no matter how things turn out. I hope you two reconnect. Why do you keep being such a stubborn fool sometimes?" I thought, "Oh, forget it, Mom.
What are you talking about?"
I was referring to the fact that Nancy is still in love with you, and if you stop being so dense, you might have a chance to fix the biggest mistake you've ever made." I was taken aback, not just by my mother's choice of words, but by the truth in her statement. "Do you really believe that?" "Yes, I do, son. That girl sounded like a woman in love during our conversation today. Don't ruin it now." I reached out to Nancy that evening and continued to call her every night throughout the week. Early Sunday morning, I picked her up and we enjoyed a fantastic day fishing on the Columbia River. That Sunday night, I prepared a homemade dinner with barbecued steaks. We spent hours talking until it was time for me to head home. When I got to my truck, I discovered that all 4 tires were flat. Nancy and I inspected the punctured tires, noticing that all 4 valve stems had been cut. "I'll call AAA, I offered. "Forget it, Jim. Do you think you can come into work late tomorrow? My first class is at 10. "So call AAA for an early morning service and stay overnight," Nancy replied. I agreed. We walked back into her apartment, relaxed, and enjoyed a beer together as we talked. We shared a moment, a closeness we hadn't felt in years. I sensed that we both wanted to reconnect in a deeper way, and it was a special evening. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and breakfast. Nancy was preparing breakfast in a lighthearted mood, and we shared a warm moment as I wrapped my arms around her waist and greeted her with, "Good morning, beautiful." Nancy chuckled. "I've never had a man flatten all 4 tires just to spend the night. I feel really special. You know, I would have done almost anything to spend more time with you, but I can't take all the credit." She looked suddenly worried. "Cliff, remind me to thank him." Fortunately, Cliff wasn't around that morning. Trio arrived at 8:30, replaced the valves, and filled the tires. I was on my way just as Nancy was leaving for her class. I decided to step back from weekend truck driving. I had a full-time job and wanted to focus on reconnecting with Nancy. The following Saturday, I was at a tavern waiting for Nancy's shift to end when Cliff and 2 of his friends walked in. They must have seen my truck outside because, after their eyes adjusted to the dim light in the bar, they spotted me and came over. The 3 of them stood around me, clearly trying to make their presence felt. I turned on my bar stool to face Cliff, catching the bouncer's watchful eye over his shoulder. "Been having some issues with your car lately?" he asked with a smirk. I chuckled and replied, "Actually, yeah, I have. You have to thank for it." Oddly enough, I was about to head home that night, not looking forward to the long drive when I found my tires flat. I decided to wait till morning, saved me the trouble of a late-night drive. So thanks for that. Maybe I was pushing my luck with that remark as Cliff stepped toward me, but the bouncer, anticipating trouble, stepped in immediately, positioning himself between us and calmly guiding Cliff toward the door. His 2 friends seemed to take the hint and backed off, following quietly. The bouncer walked back through the door and approached me. "Am I going to have any trouble with you?" "Not at all," I replied. "I'm just going to finish this beer and head to my girl's place. Thanks for handling that situation. I'm pretty sure I could take on Cliffy, but 3-on-1 doesn't feel like fair odds. Is there anything I can do to thank you?" I reached into my wallet, ready to pull out a few bills. "Just tip the bartender well," he suggested. We split all the tips at the end of the night. "Watch your back," he added. "Some guys are dumb enough to be dangerous. A few keep guns under their seats, just waiting for a chance to use them." "Thanks for the heads up," I said. "I'll be careful with that." I finished my beer and slipped out the back door. I circled around the building, checking the parking lot. I didn't see Cliff or his friends, so I got in my truck and headed over to Nancy's work, just in case. Turns out I was right to worry. Cliff was inside the diner, causing a scene. I got there just in time to see him grab Nancy by the shoulders, shaking her. The cook and a few customers were on their phones, some dialing 911, others recording what was going on. I walked over to Cliff and pulled him away. He turned toward me with rage in his eyes. "Cliff, be a man," I said. "Let's take this outside, one-on-one. Tell your two friends to step back, and let's see what you've got. Come on, let's do this." Cliff hesitated, glancing between me and his two buddies, clearly trying to decide. I kept pushing him, without going overboard. People were still recording, and I didn't want to look like the bad guy. "Come on, Cliff," I said. "I know you're looking to take it out on someone, and you're too much of a man to go after Nancy. Let's go outside, and you'll have your chance to prove you're the tough guy. This is your moment. Don't waste it." I didn't give Cliff a moment to think about it. I just turned around, walked out the door, and waited in the parking lot. Now Cliff had no choice but to follow, or he'd risk looking weak in front of his friends. It wasn't exactly a fair fight. Fortunately, Cliff's friends stayed back while he and I went at it. Cliff fought like a typical street brawler, but he wasn't very good. He tried to clinch me a couple of times, but I made him regret coming in close. Then he switched tactics and tried kicking me, though he clearly didn't have much skill in whatever martial arts move he was attempting. After I managed to grab his foot and flip him back a second time, he just rushed at me, flailing his arms. He ended up with a bloody nose for his efforts. "Give it up, Cliff. You gave it a shot, but it's not working. You've shown you're man enough to face me. That's all anyone could ask." Cliff looked tired and ready to keep going, but just then, a cop car pulled up. The officer was smart and respectful. He didn't act like some overzealous deputy instead. He took statements from both of us, spoke to a few bystanders, and reviewed a couple of the videos they showed him. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate your attempt to de-escalate things inside, but I'll warn you, we don't want fist fights in the county, nor do we want this escalating further. Mr. A, I could take you in based on what I see in this video. Miss Davis isn't pressing charges, and frankly, she could if she asked. I'd be placing you in custody right now. Do you think you can drop all of this and go home, leaving these folks in peace?" Cliff was smart enough to agree. He grabbed his hat off the ground, got in his car, and left. The officer came back to where Nancy and I were standing. I wish I could do more, but unless Miss Davis is willing to file a complaint against Mr. Ray, all I can do is give him a warning. You might want to consider a restraining order. From what your cook told me about Mr. Ray's previous harassment, along with the videos today, I don't think that would be an issue. Nancy replied, "Thanks, officer. I'll think about it. Maybe I'll go in on Monday and sign." Unfortunately, the situation worsened over the weekend. On Sunday, we went fishing in the morning and out to dinner in the evening. Two couples approached us at our table to warn us that Cliff had been seen around town making threats, specifically targeting me. There were rumors that Cliff was armed and dangerous, probably just gossip, but it still made us uneasy. I'm not a coward. I have no problem handling a fair fight, one-on-one. But this was spiraling out of control. I knew how to use a weapon, but I couldn't be with Nancy every moment. If Cliff decided to go after her, what would I do? Besides, I'd spent 3 years in the army without ever taking a life. Could things get so bad that I'd have to kill someone or risk getting killed in my own hometown? Nancy had the following week off from school for spring break. I still had to work, but she decided to spend the week at my place on the west side. That's when everything took a turn. Unbeknownst to me, while I was at work on Monday, Nancy visited my mother. Later, I learned the events that followed. Nancy explained the situation with Cliff, and my mom knew just what to do. "Do you know Cliff's parents?" she asked. "Yes, I met them several times when Cliff and I were dating." "Do you have their phone number?" Nancy found their number in her address book and gave it to Mom. She called them, and on Monday afternoon, she and Nancy drove to Cliff's parents' house in Kent. When I got home from work, Nancy didn't mention any of it, only saying she had a nice visit with our mom, which made me feel good. Wednesday evening, my phone rang. Without any introduction, the voice on the other end began speaking, not in a friendly tone, but the words were music to my ears. "I want you to know it's over. I won't be bothering you or Nancy anymore." It took a moment to register. "That's great, Cliff. I know we'll never be friends, but I appreciate this, and I appreciate you calling to let us know." There was a long, long silence, neither of us knowing what to say next. Cliff finally broke it. "Okay, tell Nancy, please. I'm going to leave her alone. Tell her I'm sorry too. She's a great gal." Then he hung up. We later heard through the grapevine that Cliff's mom and their pastor visited him the day after my mom talked to his. Cliff's mother told him she hadn't raised him to end up in jail, which was exactly where he was headed if he kept going down this path. Whether the pastor said anything specific wasn't clear, but whatever was said among the three had the intended effect. It turned out the rumor about Cliff carrying a gun was just that, a rumor started by busybodies with nothing better to do. We only saw Cliff once after that at a dance hall, and we all ignored each other. When the spring quarter ended, Nancy moved back to Tacoma into my mother's spare room. She said no more cohabitation for her. She'd only move in when she was Mrs. Peterson again. Nancy and I remarried on July 1st, 2011. Scotty Johnson came up to Washington with his girlfriend, a beautiful woman named Crystal, and served as my best man. Nancy asked my mother to be her maid of honor. It was a wonderful ceremony, surrounded by 30 of our friends and family who came to celebrate with us. Sergeant Morales and his wife Kate couldn't attend the wedding, but by the time our daughter Robin was born 16 months later, Ramon and Kate were back in Texas and agreed to be Robin's godparents. 2 years later, we had a son. Nancy finished her studies and became a first-grade teacher. Her capacity for love is incredible. She's an amazing mother, a devoted teacher, and despite the demands of her work and the time spent with the kids, I never feel overlooked. I suppose I was lucky to meet people who helped me grow into the man I am, which gave me a second chance with Nancy. Maybe it was all just fate. I'll leave it to others to debate if there's a God or if he's responsible for my part. I try to honor my good fortune by being a great father to my 2 children and a devoted husband to my wife.